fourth session of this course on ultimate truth, the wisdom of ultimate truth. And this morning I thought to start with a meditation, because last week at the end of the class I had been talking about one type of selflessness or emptiness regarding our own self, and that involves believing in a self that's permanent, unitary, and independent. Now, not everybody necessarily has that kind of conception, but some people do because of education they have received. Certain religions or spiritual traditions, philosophical traditions teach the existence of a soul or an Atman, having those kind of qualities. And so if we've learned that as a child or any time in our life, then and believed in it, we might have that kind of conception inside of ourselves, that we have a soul that is permanent and unitary and independent. And so I talked about that, and I wanted to lead a meditation on it, but we didn't have time last time. So this morning I'll begin with a meditation to just look into our mind, into our experience, to see whether or not we have that kind of idea about ourselves, just exploring it. But we'll begin with the prayers as usual, and then go into the meditation from there. And when doing the prayers, if you wish, if you can imagine in front of you the Buddha, Shakyamuni Buddha, who is someone who totally transformed himself, his mind, and freed his mind from all disturbing and afflictive states of mind, ignorance, greed, hatred, and so forth, and developed all the positive qualities, universal love and compassion for all living beings, and is totally dedicated to helping every single living being to be free of suffering and to reach nirvana and enlightenment as well. So he's someone we can turn to for help and guidance, someone we can rely on. And his teachings are the Dharma, and his followers, especially those who have realized ultimate truth, emptiness, are the Sangha. So these are the objects that we take refuge in Buddhism. So if you're comfortable with that idea, you can follow along, and we'll recite this prayer of taking refuge, and then generating bodhicitta, the aspiration to become Buddhas ourselves so that we can help all living beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By my practice of giving and other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By my practice of giving and other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By my practice of giving and other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. And then the four immeasurable thoughts are elaborations on this attitude of concern and kindness and compassion for all living beings and the wish to help them. May all sentient beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all sentient beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May all sentient beings be inseparable from the happiness that is free from suffering. May all sentient beings abide in equanimity, free from attachment for friends and hatred for enemies. Then let's recite the mantra of the Buddha a few times. And while doing that, you can imagine rays of light and nectar flowing from the Buddha in front of you and coming into yourself, filling your body and mind. And it clears away or purifies any negative thoughts, emotions, and even physical problems like sickness and pain. Imagine those getting pacified or cleared away. The light and nectar also blesses or nourishes our mind so that we can more quickly develop the positive qualities that will enable our mind to eventually become like the Buddha's mind. Tayata Om Muni Muni Mahamunaye Soha. 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 Tayata Om Muni Mahamunaye Soha. Tayata Om Muni Muni Mahamunaye Soha. Tayata Om Muni Muni Mahamunaye Soha. So continue sitting quietly for a few minutes, and you can pay attention to the breath, your breathing flowing in and flowing out, and let your body settle down, be as relaxed as possible, and also let your mind settle down. If there are thoughts in your mind, for example, you may have thoughts about things that you did today or just before starting this class, or any time in the past, yesterday, last week, and so on. So let go of or put aside those thoughts for now. And similarly, if you have thoughts about things you're going to do later, today, tonight, tomorrow, next week, put those thoughts aside for now. So those are just thoughts in the mind. They're not permanent things that are always there. They're like clouds that come and go in the sky. So we can decide to leave them aside, put them aside, and focus on something else, like what we're doing right here, right now. So focusing on the breathing, being aware of the breathing, each breath coming in and going out is helpful to be in the present, because our breathing is happening in the present. It's happening right here, right now, not in the past or the future or some other place. So focusing on the breath helps our mind to settle down in the present. So do that for a few minutes. And now let's also generate a positive motivation as our reason for participating in this class, this session, doing meditation, listening to the talk, and so on. So the ideal motivation to have is altruism, bodhicitta in Sanskrit. This is having the wish to help all living beings to be free of all their suffering and the causes of suffering, and help them achieve all happiness and the causes of happiness, which are virtuous actions, virtuous states of mind. And ideally, we wish to help all living beings reach the highest states possible, nirvana or liberation, and enlightenment, Buddhahood. And to be able to do that, we ourselves need to become enlightened, become Buddhas, which is possible. We can do it. We have the potential. It's just a question of learning the right things, practicing the right things, training our mind. And eventually, it's not easy and it's not quick, but eventually our mind can reach enlightenment. And then we'll be in a position where we can help all other beings as well to reach enlightenment. So try to have that as your reason for being here and listening to this talk, participating in this session. And if you're not comfortable with that idea, try to at least have an attitude of kindness, compassion, towards other people, other beings, wishing to help them, wishing to not harm them as much as possible. And you can think, I want to learn something here that will help me to be more helpful to others. Okay, so now for the meditation, do your best to keep your mind focused on what we're doing right now. If other thoughts come up in your mind that are not related to the meditation, just put them aside and bring your attention back to the meditation. So start by getting in touch with your sense of I, your sense of self or I. One way to do this is to think of an experience where you felt some strong emotion. Could have been a sense of joy or excitement about some wonderful thing that just happened. Or it could be something more painful and disturbing. Like if somebody did something that upset you, you got angry, or you felt worried, anxious about something that might happen, or very sad. So there are times when we have a strong emotional feeling, and at those times our sense of self or I becomes more clear and more vivid. So try to remember such an experience you had, preferably something recent so it is still fresh in your mind. When you have recalled that emotional experience, see if you can look behind it or beneath it. Try to catch a glimpse of the I, sense of I that is feeling that experience, that emotion. And don't worry if you have difficulty with this. It is difficult. Our sense of I can seem really strong and vivid, but then when we try to catch hold of it, it's like trying to catch hold of an eel, something really slippery that just keeps slipping out of our hands. So just do the best you can. Just try to get a more clear picture of that I who gets emotional, who feels emotions. And now ask yourself if this I is something permanent and unchanging. So Buddhism explains the word permanent as unchanging. It doesn't change, it stays the same all the time. And so, does your I seem to be like that? Something that's always there, always has been there, always will be there, doesn't change. For example, do you have the sense that your I that exists right now at this moment is the same I that existed yesterday? And also last year, if you think of a point in time last year, maybe when you first heard about the pandemic, the news of the pandemic came out. So at that point in time, you were there and you heard that news and you probably had some reaction to it. So the I that existed then and the I that existed now, are they the same I? And then if we remember some experience from our childhood, when we were a small child or a teenager, so if we remember that experience, do we have the feeling that that was me, the I who exists right now at this moment, was that same person back then, the same person, the same I? Do you have that feeling? And then if we look the other way to the future, we probably have thoughts about the future, plans for what we're going to do later, in today or tomorrow or next week or next month. So we sometimes have these thoughts about the future and we imagine ourselves doing certain things, being in certain places, and so on. And so when thinking about the future, the I of the future, is it exactly the same as the I of this moment? And then if you do think there's a permanent, fixed, unchanging I who is there at all times, past, present, and future, then ask yourself, what is that thing? What kind of phenomena is it? Is it something I can find and point to within my being, within my body and mind? So don't worry if you can't answer that question. It's helpful just to ask the question, just to explore that idea. But now let's move on to the second of the three attributes of this kind of self or I, which is unitary, or we can also call it monolithic. So the meaning of that is not having any parts. So does our I, when we say I or we think I, is the I something that is whole, unitary, monolithic, one whole complete thing that doesn't have any parts to it? If that was the case, we couldn't talk about parts of ourself. For example, parts of our body, my head, my eyes, my arms, my hands, my toes, my heart, my stomach. We couldn't say those things because we would just be one whole partless thing. And we also couldn't talk about different parts of our mind or our personality, like my happiness or my anger or my thoughts, my knowledge, my feelings. So if the I was one whole partless thing, then we should be able to find it somewhere inside of ourselves. We should be able to find something inside that is whole, partless, monolithic. So again, don't worry if you can't answer that question. It's enough just to start the process of thinking about it, exploring it. Now let's look at the third of the three attributes of this kind of self, which is independent. So the meaning here of independent is independent of causes and conditions, not depending on anything else for its existence. So if our I, our self, was something independent, then we would be able to exist without depending on our parents, our mother and father giving birth to us. Is that the case? would also be able to exist without depending on anything else, like food, water, air. Is that the case? So with this meditation, we are challenged to try to find an I, a self, a me that has these three attributes: permanent, meaning unchanging; unitary, meaning partless; and independent, meaning not depending on anything else, any causes and conditions. And we need to explore and see if such a thing can exist. And if there was such an I that had those attributes, then it wouldn't be able to do anything. It wouldn't be able to do any daily actions, even walking or talking or eating or working on the computer or talking on the phone. It couldn't do those things because it would be something permanent and unchanging. So it would be like frozen, fixed, always exactly the same, not changing in even the slightest way. And so it couldn't move, couldn't walk, couldn't eat, couldn't look at a computer screen, because all those things require movement, change. And also from the point of view of spiritual practice, Dharma practice, a permanent, unitary, independent I would not be able to practice meditation, gain knowledge and wisdom, and develop more positive qualities, and eventually attain higher states like nirvana and enlightenment. So it wouldn't be able to do all those things because it's frozen, fixed, always exactly the same, never changing, and also independent, not depending on anything else, able to stand by itself, totally separate and autonomous. So such a self or person would always be exactly the same and could never change, become better, and eventually attain nirvana or enlightenment. So to conclude the meditation, just ask yourself if it's reasonable to believe in such a self, such an I. Is it realistic, or is it something that's more like a fantasy, fabrication of the mind, a creation of the mind, but something that doesn't actually exist in reality? So if you had any difficulty with that meditation, if you found it difficult to explore your sense of self and try to understand what it is and how it exists and so on, don't worry. It is a difficult thing to do, and it's something that we need to do again and again. And it's also helpful in different situations, especially times when we do have a strong sense of self or I, like when we get emotional, upset, frightened, anxious. Although at those moments, it's very difficult to stop and say, what is this I? We're too kind of caught up in the emotion and the situation. But afterwards, after that experience, when you're in a bit more calm and peaceful situation, then it's good to try to remember that experience and explore that sense of I that came up so strongly. So we'll do more of this. This is just an initial exploration of our sense of I. So before we go on to the new material for today, there were a couple of questions that came up from last week. Rashika asked, are conventional truths and emptiness connected, for lack of a better word? If there were no conventional truth, then would there be an ultimate truth? So this is a really good point. One thing, we say ultimate truth is emptiness, according to the Madhyamaka school. And we usually talk about it in singular, emptiness, and that can give the idea that there's just one emptiness that sort of is everywhere and pervades everything. And that's actually not true. That's a kind of misconception. And there are actually many emptinesses. So it's plural, not singular. So emptiness or emptinesses are the true nature, the ultimate nature of every single phenomena. Everything that exists has emptiness as its ultimate nature. And each phenomena has its own emptiness, although each emptiness is basically the same. It's the same kind of thing. It's the absence of inherent existence. But still, we can say that each phenomena has an emptiness because, for example, a pen has emptiness of inherent existence as its true nature, its actual way of existing. And while the pen exists, as long as the pen exists, then its emptiness exists. But if the pen gets destroyed, like if it's in a fire and it gets completely burned and melted and it's no longer a pen, there's no longer a pen that exists that we can use and so on, then the emptiness of the pen also goes out of existence. It doesn't continue existing even when the pen doesn't exist anymore. Okay, so the emptiness of an individual phenomenon comes into existence when that phenomenon does. So when the pen was made in the factory, at that time, its emptiness came into existence. And then when the pen goes out of existence, its emptiness also goes out of existence. So in that way, the emptiness of the pen depends on the pen. If the pen doesn't exist, then its emptiness doesn't exist. Of course, there's lots of other emptinesses. There's emptiness of me, and emptiness of you, and emptiness of millions of other pens in the world, and all the other things that exist. So there's plenty of other emptinesses, but the emptiness of a particular object only exists as long as that object does. So what Rishika says is correct, that the emptiness of an object, a conventional truth like a pen or a table or a body or whatever, that emptiness depends on that object. If that object isn't there, its emptiness isn't there. So yes, emptiness or ultimate truths do depend on conventional truths. And it's also the other way around. Conventional truths depend on emptiness, but that's more difficult to understand. So I'm not going to try to explain it now. When we get more understanding of emptiness later on, then we can come back to that and look at how conventional truths depend on emptiness. So they are interdependent. Conventional truths and emptiness are dependent on each other, interdependent. And then a second part of her question is, what do you call something that is different in name but shares the same function? I'm not sure exactly if I understand what she's asking, but we do, in Buddhist philosophy, there are many cases of terms, two different terms that are interchangeable or equivalent. We usually call these synonyms. We say they're synonyms. And it's similar in just in our conventional world. We have different names for the same object. For example, car and automobile. Okay, so you have that thing with wheels and seats and a steering wheel and an engine, and you can get in and go somewhere. So you can call it a car, you can call it an automobile. They're two different names for the same thing. And so in Buddhist philosophy, there are terms like that as well. For example, impermanent and conditioned things. So an impermanent thing and a conditioned thing, those are two different terms, and they do have slightly different meaning, but they refer to the same thing. So again, like the pen or our body. Okay, these are things that are impermanent. They're changing all the time. And also they are conditioned, which means they arise from causes and conditions. They don't exist on their own, but they come into existence in dependence on causes and conditions. So those terms, impermanent and conditioned thing, are synonymous. They can both be used to refer to the same thing. Okay, another question from Christine Bessier. Regarding that existent phenomena are those knowable or understandable by a mind, what about the example of the sound of the storm in a different area? So this kind of reminds me of that saying, or I guess it's more of a question or a riddle. If a tree falls in a forest and there's nobody around to hear it, does it make a sound? You probably heard that one. And I suppose there's different answers to it. And if this question was asked to a Buddhist teacher or a Buddhist master, you might get different answers. But one answer that a Buddhist would give is yes, the tree falling in the forest does make a sound, even if there's no human beings in the forest. There are probably lots of other beings. There's always creatures, animals and birds and insects who can hear sounds. Okay, so there would be a sound that would be heard by other kinds of beings. And also, when this similar kind of question comes up, at least in the Mahayana tradition, then we would say, yeah, somebody just mentioned a Buddha. We say that there are many Buddhas, in fact, not just one Buddha, but many Buddhas. And the mind of a Buddha is omniscient, which means they know everything. They're aware of everything. Whatever is happening anywhere in the universe, they know it. And their mind is always valid. It's always a valid cognizer, a reliable cognizer. So there's always the mind of a Buddha that can hear sounds, even if there's nobody else around to hear them. Or if you think about the Sahara Desert or the Ganges River, and on the bottom there's a lot of sand and, many grains of sand. So it might be difficult to say there's some being who can see every single grain of sand in the Sahara Desert or in the bottom of the Ganges River. But there's always the Buddha, the Buddha's mind. A Buddha's mind would see every grain of sand. So I think it's similar with this question about the sound of a storm. So if there's a storm happening out in the desert where there's nobody around, or maybe on another planet, they talk about storms happening on other planets like Mars. So no worries. There's some being somewhere that will hear that sound. Okay, so let's move on. And if there are other questions, I'll try to answer them at the end of the class today or next week, next time we have a class. I'd like to get into the material for today. So Shanti, if you could put up the slides. Okay, so the next, okay. So this is from last week. I introduced 3 different levels of selflessness. And I had mentioned previously that the term selflessness is interchangeable with emptiness. So that's another example of, 2 terms referring to the same thing, selflessness and emptiness. But it's also important to understand there are different kinds of selflessness, different kinds of emptiness. Just like, for example, apple, you can say apple, but actually there's many different kinds of apples, especially in America or, some countries. You go to the supermarket and you have red delicious apples and Fuji apples and I don't know, many, many different kinds of apples. Yeah. So it's kind of similar. We don't have that many different kinds of emptiness or selflessness, but anyway, the point is there are different kinds of emptiness. So if you come across the term emptiness or selflessness, it's good to know that there are different kinds. And so you have to check what kind of emptiness are you talking about? What kind of selflessness are you talking about? They're not all the same. So here are 3 different kinds of selflessness of a person or an I. So in Buddhism, a person isn't just a human being. I think in English, when we say person, we always think of a human being. But in Buddhism, a person is any kind of being, including animals, insects, fish, birds. So they are persons too. And I'm sure people who own pets would agree with this because they know their pet very well and they know that their pet has a personality, that they have their own kind of emotions and thoughts and characteristics and ways of behaving. So you might be glad to know that according to Buddhism, your pet is a person. And also a Buddha is a person. It's any being with mind, consciousness, awareness. So there's 3 different levels of selflessness when we talk about an I, like oneself. We say I regarding oneself. And then we have other words for other people, him, her, you, he, she, and they, and so on. So there's these different terms we use for persons. Okay, so when it comes to persons, there's 3 different levels of selflessness or emptiness. And last week, we started looking at the first one, which is considered very coarse, very gross. And then there's a coarse a coarse level we haven't gone to yet. And then the subtle one, is the emptiness or the selflessness of an inherently existing self. So that's the one we're really aiming for eventually. We'll get to that one. That's the emptiness explained in the Madhyamaka Prasangika school. It's the most subtle kind of emptiness. But if we just immediately jump into that and try to understand that, we might find ourselves over our heads, like jumping into the deep end of a swimming pool. So it's actually quite useful to go through these other levels, the more coarse ones, and get used to thinking about those. And that can help our mind be more ready to jump into the third one, the emptiness of an inherently existing self. Yeah, so last week I talked about the first one, very coarse, the emptiness or selflessness of a permanent, unitary, and independent self. And so that's the one we were just looking at in the meditation. And this whole question of self was apparently a topic of discussion in India at the time of the Buddha and even before the Buddha's time. So there were lots of philosophers and meditators, yogis, who were dedicating their whole lives, some often living in the forest and just spending all their time meditating, contemplating, and trying to understand things. And this was one of the topics that they were concerned about. What is the self? What is the I? What is the person? And they would ask questions like, is there a self or isn't there? And if it does exist, what kind of qualities does it have? Is it permanent? Is it impermanent? And also some of these yogis were meditators, and they would develop very strong concentration or samadhi. And when you develop samadhi, when you learn to, your mind gets very concentrated, you can have experiences of remembering past lives. Yeah, so lots of meditators and also lots of just ordinary people have memories of past lives. And so some of these meditators would remember their past lives, and they would also remember actions that they did in their past lives that were the cause for things that they were experiencing in the present life. And that's what we call karma. Okay, so in one lifetime you do an action, and then in a later lifetime you experience the result of that. And so then they would wonder, well, okay, so how does that happen? How does an action done in one life by one person lead to an experience in a later life by a different person? Because each lifetime we have a different body, we have different experiences. We're kind of like a different person from one life to the next. But there's something that connects one life to the next, some connection. So thinking about this, they came up with this idea of this kind of self or soul or Atman, something that's permanent, something that doesn't change from one life to the next, but stays the same. And that becomes the thing that carries the karma from one life to the next. So they came up with this idea that it must be permanent and also unitary and also independent of causes and conditions. So that was their solution to this question of what it is that goes from life to life, carrying the karma. So the Buddha most probably learned these ideas before he became enlightened. He did study with a number of teachers and practiced what they taught, but realized that wasn't enough. He mastered what he had learned from his teachers, but he looked into his mind and saw he still wasn't free of suffering. There was still ignorance, there was still craving in his mind. So then he went off and meditated on his own. And what he realized was that this kind of a self, permanent, unitary, independent self, which so many people around him believed in and were teaching to their followers, he realized there's no such thing. This doesn't exist. And he also realized that if you have attachment to, if you believe in and you're attached to this kind of self, that actually becomes the cause of suffering. That is something that keeps us in samsara, keeps us in cyclic existence. So he realized the absence, the emptiness of that kind of self. He realized a lot more than that, but that was one realization that he had. And yeah, and so he taught, when he began teaching to his followers, he taught there's no such thing, no such self that's permanent, unitary, and independent. And I think it seems like Buddha was quite radical. He was kind of a revolutionary, a radical. Maybe some people would even call him a heretic, because he was going against the normal ideas in India at that time. So anyway, his realization was that, we have to realize selflessness, non-self, emptiness, in order to be free of suffering. So next slide. Okay, so when we say there's no self that's permanent, unitary, independent, or the other levels of selflessness, no self that is inherently existing, we don't want to conclude that that means there is no self at all. I don't exist at all. You don't exist. Nobody exists. That's a mistake. That's a wrong conclusion. We do exist. And what it is that exists, what kind of self that does exist conventionally. So there's no permanent, unitary, independent self. That is just something created by the mind, by these philosophers, teachers and meditators and so on. So they just invented that idea. It doesn't actually exist. But there is a self that does exist. So the second bullet point, we also looked at this last time. The self that does exist is the I that is imputed in dependence on 4 or 5 aggregates. And then there's a list of the aggregates, because not everyone is familiar with that term, aggregate, but it's used all throughout Buddhism. So Buddha spoke about a person, like you or me or any person, as consisting of these 5 aggregates. So the first one is form. So that word form refers to our body. So all the different parts of our body, skin, blood, bones, and so on, organs, and then down to really tiny particles like molecules and atoms and subatomic particles. So all the physical parts of us, that is what's included in the first aggregate, form aggregate. The other 4 aggregates are all mental. They're different parts of our mind. Feeling, the second aggregate, is a mental factor, one aspect of our mind. And it's said to be ever present, in the sense that every single moment, every single experience we have, there's always a feeling component. Mental factor feeling is always present. And there are 3 types of feelings: pleasant feeling, unpleasant feeling, and neutral, meaning neither pleasant nor unpleasant. So every experience we have with our 6 senses, so we have 6 senses. The first 5 are physical, seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, and then bodily sensations, bodily experiences. And the sixth sense is the mental consciousness, and that includes all our thoughts and our memories and our dreams and our emotions. So, with every single experience of any of these six types of consciousness, there's always a feeling present. And it's one of these three: pleasant. So, for example, when we see something beautiful, some beautiful object, like maybe looking at the Buddha image behind me, although it's not really behind me because it's a virtual screen. But anyway, you can see this image of the Buddha. So maybe you have a pleasant feeling looking at the image of the Buddha. And then if we look at something unpleasant, like a big pile of garbage, then we probably have an unpleasant feeling. And if we look at something that's neither attractive nor unattractive, like just a plain white wall, you probably feel neither pleasant nor unpleasant, just neutral. So those are examples of the three types of feelings with our visual sense, seeing. But it's the same with all of our other senses: hearing, smelling, tasting, bodily sensations, and also with our thoughts. Always one of those three types of feelings is present. The third aggregate is called discrimination, and that's another mental factor that's always present. And it has the job of recognizing distinguishing marks or characteristics of an object so that we can tell one thing from another. Okay, so whenever we see something, we are able to differentiate that object from another object. Basically, what we see, what appears to our visual consciousness, are colors and shapes. And then it's our mental consciousness that will say, oh, that's blue, or that's yellow, that's a box, that's a wheel, that's a human being, that's a donkey, and so on. But our eye consciousness will see colors and shapes and is able to differentiate different colors and different shapes, and so on. With all of our six senses, our six consciousnesses, we have this mental factor that can tell one thing from another. And then the fourth aggregate is called compositional factors. And that is like a big bag containing all the other mental factors. There's many different mental factors. Some of them are negative emotions like anger, attachment, jealousy, and so forth. Some of them are virtuous like faith and loving kindness and compassion. So there's many different mental factors. So they're all heaped into that one aggregate, the fourth aggregate. And the last aggregate is consciousness. And this refers to the six types of main minds or primary minds, which are associated with our six senses. So just seeing itself, seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, feeling sensations in our body, and the mental consciousness, thinking, and so forth. So anytime we have any of those six types of experience, then that's the mental factor of consciousness. So this is like dividing a person into 5 groups. And you could simplify this and just have 2, body and mind. But you need to understand that each of those 2 things, body and mind, is made up of many different parts. We know our body is made up of parts. Mind is more difficult to understand as we can't see it, but mind has parts as well. So these are some of the parts of the mind, the last 4 aggregates. So these are the things that make us up. And all of these things, these five aggregates are impermanent, meaning they're changing all the time. Oh, sorry, not yet. I will go back. They're changing all the time. They don't stay the same from one moment to the next. They are dependent on causes and conditions. Okay, so they are impermanent, conditioned phenomenon. And so if we look among these five aggregates and try to find something that's permanent, it's very difficult. I mean, you can do that. It's good to do. It's good to try that on your own. Can you find anything within your body and mind that's permanent, unchanging? It's always exactly the same from one moment to the next and doesn't change. So try that. And then the second quality of that false kind of self is unitary, meaning it doesn't have parts. It can't be broken up into parts. So again, look within your body and mind and see if you can find something that can't be broken down into smaller parts. So with our body, we can break things down into cells and molecules and atoms. And I haven't studied physics, but what I've heard is they can keep breaking down things down into smaller and smaller parts, and they haven't found the smallest part. It can't be broken down any further. So there is no such thing as the kind of a particle that's the basic building block of all physical phenomena, all material phenomena. They used to think so. I think that was Newton's idea. Isaac Newton thought there was a basic building block that can't be broken down any further, but they haven't been able to find it. They keep finding smaller and smaller parts. So everything has parts. And the same with the mind. Mind also has parts. Okay, that's harder to see because we can't see our mind. But with greater mindfulness, paying attention to our mind, observing our mind, we can see more about our mind. And those who develop that ability to see their mind very clearly can see that it has parts too, because it's changing all the time. Every minute, every second, every tiny millisecond, there's a different mind, a different experience arising, and that passes, and the next one arises, and that passes. So there's this, constant change happening in the mind. So the mind is made of parts as well. And then the third quality of independent means doesn't depend on causes and conditions. So if we look at the five aggregates, we can see that they depend on causes and conditions. It's obvious with our form. I mean, we don't remember being in our mother's womb and being born, but we can see that's where human beings come from. We know that from looking at maybe some of you also have been mothers and have given birth to children. So you know that a human body comes into existence in dependence on causes and conditions. And so without those causes and conditions, it cannot exist. It cannot come into existence. And with the four mental aggregates, it's a little more difficult to see, but according to Buddhist teachings, each experience, each part of our mind arises in dependence on other phenomena, causes and conditions. The previous moment of mind, objects that we see, and also with our five senses, they only occur if our senses are functioning. So some people are blind, their eye organ is not working, and so they are unable to have that kind of experience of visual consciousness. And the same, some people are deaf, so that organ is not working properly, they cannot hear. So the existence of the five sense consciousnesses depends on the physical body, the physical sense organs being present and functioning properly. So anyway, that's just in brief. But this is a big topic in Buddhism, actually. It's really good to learn about and get familiar with how every part of us, every part of our body, every part of our mind is impermanent, changing all the time, is made up of parts, so it's not unitary, and is dependent, not independent. Depends on causes and conditions. So I'm introducing this now because it will also come up later when we talk about the Madhyamaka view of emptiness of inherent existence. So this topic of dependence is very, very important to understand emptiness. So anyway, this is what we are. We are made up of these 5 aggregates, and each of the 5 aggregates is also made up of yet other parts. And so what is the I that does exist is just what's imputed. So we have this set of aggregates and we call it I, or Sangye Khadro, or Shanti, or whatever your name is. So it's just a name or a pronoun given to this collection of 4 or 5 aggregates. And that is the self that exists. And that's not easy to understand. So I thought it can be helpful to look at a more concrete example, like a bicycle. So the next slide. So we all know what bicycles are. Probably most of us know how to ride them, maybe own one. So when we see this object in the photograph, or we actually see one in the street outside, we immediately think, our mind thinks bicycle. And we probably don't go any further than that. We just think that's a bicycle. But have you ever questioned what exactly is a bicycle? What exactly is a bicycle? And is there something we can point to, some part of a bicycle we can point to and say, that is the bicycle? So the next slide, someone has made this easier for us. There's a Canadian photographer, I can't remember his name, but he likes to do this. He likes to take things apart and put all the parts and then photograph them. Okay, so this is a disassembled bicycle. Although these are just the main parts, because each of these parts can also be broken down into smaller parts, especially all the way down to the molecules and the atoms and the subatomic particles. But this is good enough for now. Anyway, these are the parts of a bicycle. So if we look at all these parts separated out, can we find a bicycle there? Do we even call this a bicycle? Can we say that's a bicycle there? One person might say, yes, it's a bicycle that's been taken apart. But another person would say, no, you can't call that a bicycle, because if it was a bicycle, we should be able to get on it and ride down the street. But that's not possible. We can't get on a bunch of parts and ride down the street. But it's really useful, and this is something that's done in Madhyamaka, we'll get to later, is to either physically take something apart or just mentally take something apart and look at all the different parts. Look at each part and say, is this a bicycle? The handlebars, just the handlebars themselves, is that a bicycle? Obviously not. A wheel, the front wheel, is the front wheel a bicycle? No. Back wheel bicycle? No. I mean, this can sound kind of silly, but it's actually quite profound. to look at each part individually and ask, is that a bicycle? And it becomes clear that no, none of the parts, not one single part of the bicycle is a bicycle, because it can't function as a bicycle. It doesn't even deserve to be called a bicycle. So it's good to get that clear in your mind, and then ask yourself, okay, so if none of the individual parts is a bicycle, then when all the parts are put together, you put all the parts together in the right way, of course. It has to be the right way, not the wrong way. You put all the parts together in the correct way, and then we have this experience, now it's a bicycle. Now there's a bicycle there. But the question is, if there wasn't a bicycle before, like now, when all the parts are disassembled and we can't find a bicycle there, and then later when all the parts are put together and we say, now there's a bicycle, what is that bicycle that's suddenly there but wasn't there before? So that's a question to ponder. And then if we apply this to a person, like for myself, I'm Sangye Khadro. That's one of my names anyway. And if we ask, what is Sangye Khadro? People will say things like, oh, she's a Buddhist nun, she's an American, she's a teacher, and so on. But those are just descriptions about what kind of person I am, where I come from, what my job is. But what exactly is the person Sangye Khadro? Because as we looked before, a person is made up of all these aggregates, 5 aggregates, but each aggregate in turn is made up of different parts. That's the whole meaning of aggregate. The word aggregate, actually the term in Sanskrit is skanda, and that means like heap. So some translators translate skanda as heap. Heap is like a pile of a whole bunch of things. So we're just this mass of different parts, just like a bicycle is made up of different parts. So if we think about all the different parts of a person, like me, Sangye Khadro, can we point to any part? Now, we're not going to take me apart. We can't take a person apart, at least as long as they're alive. After they die, then, they do an autopsy and they take the body apart. Not completely, but anyway, while we're alive, we can't be taken apart like we can with a bicycle. But mentally, we can conceptually think of all the different parts that make up a person. And if we look at all those different parts and we try to find one part that is a person, especially if we're trying to look for a permanent, unitary, independent person, a person that is permanent and unchanging, unitary, doesn't change, isn't made of parts, and independent of causes and conditions. If we try to find that kind of person, is that possible? So this is the exercise, and I invite you to do it on your own. We're almost finished with our time, I think. Yeah, we just have 10 minutes left, so we don't have much more time to talk about this, but it's something you can continue exploring on your own. And it does help to have this kind of a more physical phenomena, like a bicycle or a car or a pen. Think about how it's made up of different parts and then ask, what is that object? So next slide. So this is just a kind of summary of what we've been talking about regarding this type of self, a permanent, unitary, independent self. So even though there are people who believe in it, according to Buddhism, it doesn't exist. But this is something we need to investigate ourselves. Don't just say, oh, well, Buddha said it doesn't exist, therefore it doesn't exist. It's good to explore that yourself. Check to see what you think. And you might disagree with the Buddha. But if you do disagree, you have to be able to explain what is that person. What is it you can point to that is this permanent, unitary, independent self? And then the second bullet point is this kind of wrong conception occurs only in relation to persons and living beings and not inanimate things like tables. So those who do have this conception, they only have it with regard to persons, not other kinds of phenomena like tables or cars or bicycles. So the third bullet point, it's good to check if this kind of conception exists in our own mind. And if we do find we have such an idea, we have such a belief, to investigate it, just like we did in that meditation, to use reasons. Well, if there was a permanent self, a permanent person, then it would never change. It would always be exactly the same. And that means it wouldn't be able to do anything. A permanent thing can't change. A permanent thing can't walk or talk or eat or sleep because those require changes. Okay, so think about it, investigate it. And then the fourth bullet point says, but even if we realize that kind of emptiness, the non-existence of that kind of self, we have not realized ultimate truth, according to Madhyamaka Prasangika. So this is not ultimate truth, the absence, the emptiness of a permanent, unitary, independent self. So then you might wonder, well, why are we talking about it then? I just want to know about ultimate truth. Well, as I mentioned before, ultimate truth, which means emptiness of inherent existence, is very subtle, very difficult to understand. And if we just try to jump right into that, we'll be floundering. So this kind of investigation of is there a permanent, unitary, independent self? Well, it's going in that direction. We're starting to question, we're starting to ask ourselves, what is my I? How do I see myself? Do I see myself realistically or not? Am I permanent or not? Am I independent or not? So these are the kind of questions that help us eventually understand emptiness. So I think it's very helpful to do this exploration. Okay, what have I got next? Yeah, so I'll just briefly introduce the next one, but we won't have time to go into it now. We'll do it next week. So this is moving on to the second level of selflessness. And it's a mouthful of words. The emptiness or selflessness of a self-supporting, substantially existent self. And this is considered coarse, but it's not very coarse. The previous one was very coarse, and this one is just coarse. Okay, so it's a little more subtle than the last one, but it's not as subtle as the Madhyamaka type of emptiness of inherent existence. So to explain the term self-supporting means it's somewhat independent of the aggregates of body and mind. So this notion of a self, the self seems to be somewhere within the body and mind, not completely separate, not completely independent, but still a little bit removed, a little bit independent. And there's analogies, which we'll get to in a minute to kind of describe it better. And the term substantially existent, this is a term you find in Buddhist philosophy. It means being able to appear to the mind without other things having to appear. That's a little obscure, but let's take an example. A tree and a forest. Okay. So we can see trees. We can open our eyes and focus them on a tree, and we can see a tree with its trunk and branches and leaves and so on. But forest, can we see a forest? Is a forest something we can see? You may say yes. If you see a whole bunch of trees in one place, you can say, oh, that's a forest. But what you're actually seeing is a bunch of trees. And, individual trees are not a forest. That tree is not a forest. That tree is not a forest. That tree is not a forest. But when you have a whole bunch of them in the same place, then you can say, oh, that's a forest. So forest is actually just labeled. It's just a name we give to a bunch of trees in one place. But a forest is not something we can actually see without seeing trees. So we have to see trees, which are not a forest, in order to see a forest, in order to say there's a forest. So that's an easy example, but it's kind of similar with a person, okay? Person is made up of aggregates, but the aggregates themselves, individual parts of us, body and mind, they are not person. They are not the person. But when you have all the aggregates together, then we say that's a person. So anyway, that's a general idea of substantial existence. I won't go into it more now because we don't have time. But let's move on to the fourth bullet point, which is an analogy of this kind of person. So this sense of self appears to be like a head salesperson in a group of salespersons. Okay, so if you have like real estate in the West, we have real estate offices where you have a whole bunch of people who are all real estate agents. They're all doing the same job, or travel agency would be another example. So everybody in that office is an agent doing the same kind of work. There's usually one person who's the boss, who's the head. And that person does the same kind of work too, sells real estate or sells travel tickets or whatever. But they're the head. So they're similar, they're kind of the same as the others, but they're the boss, they are the head. So this kind of self seems like it's within the aggregates. It's part of the aggregates, not separate from the aggregates, but it seems to be in a somewhat superior position, like a boss, a director. And it's kind of more independent. The aggregates depend on the I, but the I doesn't depend on the aggregates. So you might be able to notice this. I give you this as your homework between now and next week, is to just try to look out for this sense of a self that's like a boss, like a director, like a CEO, somewhere inside of us. Maybe we feel it in our head. We might think, inside my head, there's something that's running this whole business. My body and mind, making the decisions, controlling things. Yeah, just check if you notice that sense of self. So that's this one. And next time we meet, we'll do a meditation to investigate that sense of self. I was going to do a meditation today, but I talked too much. We ran out of time. So just the last slide is summary of the main points that we looked at today. Should be one more slide, or did I forget? Okay, so what we did today, we did meditation on the permanent unitary independent self, checking if it's realistic or not. And then we talked more about the self that does exist, which is imputed independence on the 5 aggregates. And then we briefly introduced this next topic of the emptiness of a self-supporting, substantially existent self. So we'll continue with that one next week, and I'm sure there's a whole bunch of questions. You can see the chat box. So yeah, if you do have questions, you can write them in the chat box or send them to Shanti, and I'll try to answer them next time. Okay, so let's finish for today with the dedication prayers. So do feel confident that we have created merit, even if you felt lost and confused. Just making the effort to learn about emptiness, to learn about ultimate truth, and doing it with a good motivation, an altruistic motivation, wanting to help sentient beings. This is really, really good. And we're doing something really, really beneficial, really virtuous. We do create a lot of merit. So let's mentally dedicate that merit to all sentient beings. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish, but increase more and more. And then also dedicate for the long lives of our precious spiritual teachers, starting with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, incomparably kind and supreme Tenzin Gyatso, the wish-fulfilling, wish-granting jewel, source of every benefit and happiness in this world. May you have a long life and all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. You who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjunath's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplish magnificent prayers honoring the three sublime ones. Savior of myself and others, your disciples, please, please live long. So thank you, everyone, for joining. Thank you, Shanti, for hosting.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Venerable, and everyone.
Thank you,
Namo
Venerable.
Buddhaya.
Thank you, Venerable.
Thank